What we're seeing now is not the end game we're shooting for. We're shooting for a state of the world and a state of trade that looks different from what we have today. I'm always going to reflexively default to free market solutions and let markets figure stuff out. But that's not an absolute. We got conditioned to these near zero interest rates. Those rates were that low for that long artificially.
Hey, welcome back to the Aerospace Executive Podcast. I'm really happy to have my really good friend, my Saturday morning coffee buddy, local neighborhood guy, Dr. Steve Horan. Steve is a professor at University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He's the former managing director for the very prestigious CFA Institute up in Charlotte, North Carolina. Probably one of the smartest people I know. And I'm just thrilled to have you on, Steve. Thanks for coming.
Greg, it's great to be here. Lots of fun.
So lots of stuff we talk about at Starbucks on the weekends. We talk about the macroeconomic environment, and a lot of people out there panicking, freaking out, tariffs. I got to get my buddy Steve on. Nobody more qualified to talk about all this stuff and how all the tides are shifting and what the macroeconomic circumstances will look like as things kind of move around a little bit. So thank you for coming on and lending us your ear.
Well, we've certainly received the Irish blessing of living in interesting times, and seems like, from our coffee conversations, the macroeconomic stuff is just one of the many world problems we solve during those conversations.
So I still remember the conversation we had over burritos, I think about last year, and we talked about $36 trillion in debt. Yeah, the nation's $36 trillion in debt. And you said, look, there's only three ways out of this. We raise taxes, probably not politically appetizing. We reduce spending, not politically appetizing, or we grow the economy, which comes with its own constraints.
Those are all the good options. The other options are, I'll list them as two separate ones, but they're kind of variations on a theme. You can, they would both fall under the category of default. So you can straight up default on the debt the way Argentina does, and it's an option. It happens. And the other one that's a variant of that is implied default, which is kind of defaulting on the debt by inflating your currency. You're deflating your currency and inflating the prices of goods and services, which, again, Argentina had done for many years. So either option makes your debt holders worse off and does get you out from underneath the real value of the debt you owe.
Yeah, we could continue to print money all day long.
Yep.
Pay your debt, but everything else feels the price in the form of inflation.
And exactly. So there are ways out of it. What I have to say that I did not anticipate during that burrito conversation a year ago is I didn't really have confidence that a reduction in government spending was going to be feasible. I just never had seen anything in the government sphere, in the public sphere, that you could do enough cost cutting to make any kind of reasonable dent for how big the problem is. And I don't know really where the Doge things are going to end up, but at least it's possible now. The problem with growing your way out of this is that now the debt has gotten so large, right? We've increased government spending from 40% of GDP in 1985, which even back then, that was high. Okay, that was twice what it was in the 60s, to now 120% of GDP. And, that's a threefold increase in kind of a relatively short period of time. And that's just in relative terms. The economy has been growing over that time, but the economy hasn't grown threefold since then. So, that is daunting. And those are the kind of numbers that we ascribe to developing nations that have debt problems.
Yeah, I was listening to a statistic back in November and was like, yeah, the U.S. economy is growing at 4%, but government spending is growing at 6%, which is also included in the GDP. So take out government spending, our GDP is actually, declining by 2.5%. Where you take out government spending, you could call the nation, in a recession.
Yeah.
Troublesome.
Yeah. Similar thing with employment. People have been looking at the top line employment numbers and have been pretty encouraged about how resilient the labor market's been. But the bulk of those employment numbers have been public service jobs. And you back those out, and at best, it's been flatlining for a long time.
Yeah. It's interesting stuff. I mean, everybody's got their own little thing, but the bottom line is that we've gotten too big. So here we are. We got the new administration, lots of chaos in the air. Tariffs. Yeah. Canada, NATO, the EU, everybody says we're abandoning our, I'm not so sure. What are you thinking? What are you thinking about the industrial policy? Yeah, we're trying to cut government spending. We're trying to put tariffs on board. Is this all gonna work, or is this all just confetti in the air and we're that we're trying to see through?
I'm optimistic it's going to work. What I think is helpful for folks to realize is that, what we're seeing now is not the end game we're shooting for. We're shooting for a state of the world and a state of trade that looks different from what we have today. And what we have to do is find a way to get there. And that's what we're experiencing today. And Trump has a particularly volatile way of getting to where he wants to go. But, the current state is not really what he wants. In fact, he's very adamant about saying how much he loves tariffs. I'm not convinced, right? And, I'm convinced he needs to say that to get what he wants. And, what kind of the smart money in Washington saying right now is don't focus so much on the tweets, but focus on the campaign promises. So, the thing is that, my thinking has evolved over the years on this. As a young economist, I was, and I still am, in a principled way, a free trader. And that argument for free trade is built on the, economics 101 concept of comparative advantage, and which basically says countries should produce the goods and services that is the most efficient for them to produce. The important nuance there that most people don't get is that what makes it efficient for you to produce something is the opportunity cost of not producing the next best thing. And so, in other words, if the U.S. can produce computer chips more cheaply than Taiwan, the U.S. still shouldn't produce computer chips if it's at the expense of producing, say, oil, which they can produce even more cheaply. So the other way to phrase that is in the positive, which is you should produce the stuff in which you have the greatest relative advantage, and that's where the name comes from. The problem with that, a very important and powerful theory that tells you we should break down trade barriers and go to free trade, is that it's a concept that just doesn't factor in other important things like social policy, public health, geopolitical tensions, strategic advantages, military and economic considerations and risks. And so very much what Trump is doing today is tying trade policy with all those other things that the concept of comparative advantage doesn't explicitly factor in.
So he's looking kind of big picture. He's like, hey, look, I got this big bucket of things I got to fix or I got to take care of.
Yep. And which is not to say there's not an economic argument here. I think there still is. But yes, he is looking big picture. And that's what makes it so complicated. And that's what makes it such a great topic of discussion for folks. There is an argument that focuses strictly on trade deficits. And, a lot of economists say there's nothing wrong with a trade deficit. And I think, that's true up to a point, but trade deficits are kind of like wine. And that is that it's fine to have a glass of wine on any given day. And it's fine to have one glass of wine. It might not be so good to have 10. So listen, if we have a trade deficit with Brazil, not a big deal. The problem is we have trade deficits with everybody. Okay. And that's a problem. And it's not just that we have trade deficits with everybody. We have had those deficits for decades. The last time we had a trade surplus was 1973. And, the only real way you can make the argument that trade deficits aren't a big deal is if they somehow average out over time or average out across countries. But neither of those two things is the case.
My question's always, I always think about things. I'm like, who should be setting industrial policy? I mean, obviously we've had a lot of good, the steel industry in this country is now, I don't want to call it decimated, but it's pretty bleak, and it's protected by tariffs. And for national security, I think for national security purposes, hey, look, we do have to have a domestic steel industry. Lots of talk about bringing shipbuilding back. For national security purposes, that's probably not a bad idea. We can't build military ships right now. You think about cargo, big box ships. They're it costs. I saw a number, $366 million to build a standard box ship in the United States versus about a little less than 50, or right out about 50 million in China or Korea. That's a big number. You think about other industries that are strategic, and probably, maybe the shipbuilding industry, and bringing it back into the United States. Who should be setting industrial policy? I mean, you've got these publicly traded companies, privately held companies, which are going to go do their thing. Is it the CEOs of them who are going, hey, I got to go do what's best for my business, we'll figure it out? Or is it the government who's saying, hey, look, we need to bring this back for domestic purposes, and we'll incentivize you. We'll use a little bit of a carrot and stick approach.
Yeah, I'm always going to reflexively default to free market solutions and let markets figure stuff out. But that's not an absolute, and it's not an absolute because markets can't, while they can figure out the economic efficiency and where capital should flow to its most productive use, what they can't figure out is what government's primary responsibilities are. And so when I think about varying from free trade solutions around things like industrial policy, I'm going to say, all right, what's the primary role of government? First and foremost, you need to protect your borders. If you don't, you really don't have much of a country to govern. right? And then there's national security. Protecting your borders is a type of national security. And then public health, hardcore public health, not, there's a continuum on things. And so I might add to your list, you could consider some pharmaceuticals being critical to public health, especially as it relates to vaccines, pandemics, right? During the pandemic, we saw that was an issue. So those are things that I think the markets have a tougher time solving for, that the government needs to establish those priorities. Now, they can go to the markets to help solution around that, right? And the development of the vaccine, for example, during the pandemic is a pretty darn good example of that, how markets can create a solution for you that there's no way the government would have been able to do. And, to your shipbuilding example, there's just an article in the journal today about how behind schedule the latest, greatest Navy ships are.
I saw that.
Yeah. And so, obviously, of course, we should be resourcing a Navy to protect our borders and, create military might. But, maybe there's ways to do that a little more efficiently than
Cuba.
What we're doing right now.
I think instead of Greenland, we go invade Cuba. Lots of waterfront property in Cuba, lots of cheap labor in Cuba. We'll go build our ships in Cuba. We'll make that the 51st state. How's that sound?
That sounds like a plan. I mean, we could add right behind the Gaza resort.
The Gaza resorts, yeah. We got Greenland. We've taken back Panama now. We've got the Gaza resorts.
Exactly.
Let's go conquer Cuba and turn it into a shipbuilding haven, right?
Well, just think, if Canada becomes the 51st state, that adds a lot of shoreline.
There you go. It does that, or we could do that too. So
with key shipping routes.
So there you go. I love it. What do you these? So let's talk these tariffs. I mean, are they really a revenue? In your opinion, are they a tax, or are they a revenue generator? Or is there ways to manipulate them so that they're a little bit of both?
I think there's ways to manipulate them so that they're a little bit of both. I don't think they're that much of a revenue generator, and I think the Trump administration knows it. I don't think that's their first best objective. I think that's their consolation prize. I actually think the Trump administration, they've been planning this for 4 years. All right, and even longer, actually. Mm-hmm. But, they were out of the game. The reason we're seeing all of this is not because somebody came up with it between November and January. Right? Mm-hmm. All the planning for this had taken place over the previous 4 years. And what our other countries are going to either respond by raising their tariffs as individuals, or they're going to band together to raise tariffs in kind of like a more powerful show of force. And I think the EU is a primary candidate for doing that. They've got a way to work together, although they work so slowly. It's not clear at all that that'll be happening. Or other countries will say, okay, got it. We'll reduce our tariffs down to this reciprocal level that you're banging on. And if that's the case, there is very little revenue generation. And I think that would be the best solution for Trump. I don't think he cares too much about the revenue. He needs to say he cares about the revenue because that feeds into its power as a negotiating tool. Not just to get the tariffs lowered, but to get all the other political concessions he's looking for on immigration, fentanyl, and the like. So, and there's plenty of room for that. I mean, if you look at the G20, and you compare US tariffs to the G20, and if you factor in what are called non-tariff barriers, so things like safety standards, things like quotas that effectively keep you out of a market, right? And you convert those into what's called a tariff equivalent. The average US tariff is 6%. The average tariff from the rest of the G20, and by the way, no one's even close to that. All right.
Mhm.
The US is the lowest of the entire group, and the average of the rest of the group is 15, 16%. So it's 2.5 times really what the US charges. It's a clear imbalance. And of course, there's no surprise there's a trade deficit, right? We're not talking small differentials. So what I think Trump does mean in terms of what he says is he just wants it fair, and he'd love to have it fair and low.
So you're talking about when you're talking about the EU, you're talking about, hey, look, quotas got to be made got to be made in Germany, or got to be made in the EU, or VAT taxes, which Canada has. Anything that's bought in Canada has a huge VAT, which effectively is a tax against anything coming into the country. I mean, last time I went to Canada, I paid a hotel bill. I was like, holy crap, this 20% VAT or whatever it was is eye-opening. So you're talking about like all these extraneous things that they don't call tariffs, but hey, they're barriers to. And I think this is where maybe people are screaming is they don't see the word tariff, but they exist.
It's that there's multiple ways to keep other countries out of your market. Right?
So, for instance, in China, you have to have, if you want to manufacture in China, you have to have a 51% Chinese partner who's going to steal who's going to steal your IP, and
that's it.
Eventually screw you over twice.
That's exactly it. By the way, I'm looking at an F-15 out the window right now. I can't not think of you when I see that. So, but that's exactly right. Your 51% partner in China is not a tariff, but it's an implicit tax, and it's certainly a trade barrier, especially when you lose your IP. And the EU has plenty of those sorts of things, and they don't do it just to us. And we're not being singled out. The EU's done that to China last decade on solar panels in an effort to try to protect their solar panel industry and protect jobs. So, I wouldn't, pick on China for that, although they're pretty heavy-handed when it comes to that. And, and then maybe just to bring this back to the revenue question is if you can reduce those barriers and reduce those tariffs so that there's a degree of equivalence and at low levels, that's first best solution. But if you can't get there and it's got to be high tariff, button up against high tariff, I think Trump's position is, all right, I'll take your money then. That's fine. And we'll make it revenue generating. Not my preference, but, at least we have a large market. And that is what creates the negotiating hammer that allows him to have these conversations, because almost every other country has more to lose than we would in terms of dollars.
American consumers are still spending money. I mean, everybody's out there. They talk about the consumer, and they always say, the consumer's pulling back. They're pulling back, but the data doesn't show that. Data said that everybody's still spending, which is kind of why we still see some inflation out there. I mean,
Yeah,
granted, it
we
comes down a
still
little
see
bit, but
we got a little bit, but it's funny. If I don't know if tariffs are inflationary truly. I mean, the you know, basic party line is that of course they're inflationary, and there is a route where that would be the case. We haven't seen it yet. The latest CPI print yesterday came in at, I think, 2.3%, 2.7% inflation. The last print before that under the Biden administration was 5.7%. So no, it's 2.4. The print yesterday came in at 2.4. Previous print was 5.7. That sounds, pretty good. So nobody's raising prices in anticipation of tariffs.
mm-hmm.
A few tariffs nominally have been put in place by now, but the big date's April 2nd. When the big hammer will come down. Egg prices, which everybody was pointing to for some reason, as they're down 30%.
Mm-hmm.
And probably the bigger reason there was the bird flu. New car prices are down, which, if anyone's thinking about, I'm going to do some pre-buying on an import to try to get ahead of a potential tariff, new cars are, one key area where you'd expect to see that, but we're not seeing that in prices. A third of the inflation really that we are seeing is coming from housing, and that has very little to do with tariffs.
Yeah, no,
that's not something you import.
It's shortage. I mean, it's a shortage. But yeah, it's funny. I just got an email from the local Chevy dealer. I made the mistake of making an inquiry, so I'm now on their email list. They're having a sale. They're having a sale. And I'm like, all right, well, if you're having a sale, that doesn't tell me that inflation is going on. So somebody's eating something somewhere, or they're just trying to get it going. But let's flip the script a little bit. And I'm going to pick your CFO brain here and say, all right, we're talking about bringing a lot of jobs back to the United States. Maybe we take some of the government workers who are in low productivity roles and move them into industry and higher productivity roles, and we can bring jobs back in and put those people into those jobs. But that's going to more investment in the country, more employment in the country, more skilled labor. That's a little bit inflationary. So here we are. We're looking back at inflation, which leads me to interest rates. And if we're inflationary, the Fed has come out and they've said this very vague. They've put these very vague. They put some lines in the water. Hey, we're gonna start to reduce rates, and I'm looking at it like, I don't think so. I'm certainly not going to hold my breath. Am I wrong?
No, I don't think you are, Craig. And I look at rates today. I didn't have a mortgage in 1982, but my parents did, right? And I look at rates today, and I like what I'm seeing relative to something like that. We got conditioned to these near zero interest rates over a decade. And those rates were that low for that long artificially. That was not market clearing by any stretch of the imagination. So there's really no reason we should use that as a reference point for what's normal, right? Yeah. Even what we're seeing today is on the low side of normal, however you want to define it. So, the interest rate question is complex in large part because the employment question is so complex. There's so many moving parts, and I'm not in the prediction market to know exactly how it turns out. But what I do know is that every day there's a large employer announcing new plans to make investments in factories in the U.S., right? And, just today, Johnson & Johnson announced plans for a $55 billion U.S. manufacturing plant in Wilson, North Carolina. All right. I mean,
Wilson. I know
right?
Wilson. My brother
It's
lives
our
in Wilson.
backyard.
My brother lives in Wilson.
So, and of course, the big news everybody was looking at is NVIDIA had said yesterday, I think it was, they're going to invest, get this number, $500 billion over the next 5 to 10 years. And these are wicked good jobs, right? Some of it is going to be around in Boston, which is going to be for quantum computing, which, for them is something that could potentially make obsolete their core GPU product. So, they're trying to get ahead of their obsolescence, and they're going to do that now in the US. And those are high skilled jobs. And Taiwan Semiconductor, $100 billion investment in 5 additional factories, 20,000 jobs is what's estimated from that one alone. Apple is another 20,000 jobs. These are large firms with large headcounts. So yeah, that's going to increase the demand for labor over time, for sure. And yes, that could be inflationary. But it's tough to know. We're still writing the chapter on Doge and all that. It's tough to know how much human capital that'll free up.
I look at it a couple ways. I mean, I remember moving here. When I moved to Carolina in 2007, mortgage rate on my house was 5 3/4. Yeah, and we were loving. We were like, yeah, baby, lock it in. We were loving life. And then the financial crisis hit in 2010. I was standing in a Las Vegas casino for walking out of a casino for NBAA, going to National Business Aviation Association, talking to my mortgage broker. And he's like, I can get you a 3.5% 15-year mortgage. And your principal goes up, or your payment goes up $100 a month, but you cut 15 years off your term. I'm like, yep, that sounds great. And then, then you find out that people are getting a 3% 30-year mortgage. Like, only on what planet? But the sad thing is people expect that to come back. And you're like, no, there's some problems with free money. Asset values, I think asset values got, you tell me, asset values got way overheated. Man.
Yep. And that's, a function of, or the result of the fact that those rates were held so low artificially. If it was market clearing, you're going to get less of that irrational exuberance.
Mm-hmm. Well, the sad thing is that, interest rates were that low and companies were still moving jobs to Mexico. And I remember John Deere. Yeah, John Deere. Hey, we're moving out of Muncie, Indiana. We're taking 800 jobs to Mexico. Interest rates are like next to nothing. Why don't you just build a new plant here? Well, it's cheaper to build in Mexico. So that's
what will be kind of interesting is see how interest rates change as capital flows change in this new trade environment. And what I mean by that, if we use Mexico as an example.
Mm-hmm.
So our trade deficit with Mexico years ago, pre-NAFTA was like 10, 20 billion. It grew to 50 billion under NAFTA. And then it held kind of steady when Trump renegotiated the contract. But since then, that 50 has grown to 175 billion. So that's US dollars heading out, unavailable for investment in the US. Now you add to that the immigration issue, right? And you've got tens of millions. We kind of don't know. Everyone puts a different number on it, whether they're documented or undocumented. is kind of irrelevant for this discussion. But they're sending money back home, right? In the order of hundreds of billions. Okay. And that's a lot of capital flow outside the border that's unavailable for investment. And that tends to jack up interest rates.
Interesting. I never thought about that. And we haven't even talked about the illicit flow of funds out of the country.
Yeah. Well, and then of course, the other illicit flow of funds is the drug trade. So if you actually put numbers on the drug trafficking and the sex trafficking and all that other stuff, that's more capital flow outside, fewer dollars for borrowing and investment in the U.S.
So probably $300-400 billion going back to Mexico or something, leaving the country, flowing out for whatever purposes. People, that's nobody really accounts for that. Nobody talks. That's the stuff that nobody's talking about. It's like all this outflow that's not staying here, and that's why I'm a big proponent. Like I like my political views, whatever. But that's why I'm a big proponent of drill, baby, drill. Our money stays here. We're drilling oil and gas in the country, and it stays here. It's not going to Saudi Arabia. It's not going to Norway. It's not going to Canada. It's staying here.
Exactly.
Which matters, provides jobs. So if I'm a CFO, what am I thinking about? Kind of in the next year, over the next year or the next 5 years, what are some of the things CFOs should be thinking about?
Well, I think onshoring. I don't think the NVIDIAs, Apples, Samsungs, and Taiwan Semiconductors of the world are being foolish, right? And they're not being short-sighted, right? They're trying to get ahead of what they see as a very long-term consideration, because it's obviously very difficult to just flick a switch and change where you're going to do your manufacturing. So I think that's the big thing. The other thing, and depending on your industry, is are you going to be able to source your raw materials? So if you need rare earth for chips and things like that, the supply chain issues here are more, honestly, they're going to be way more important than the tariffs. The tariffs are an expense, right? If you can't source your inputs, that's game over.
It's very interesting. I was talking to the president of a company in Illinois, and he says, "Look, my prices are a little higher, but it's all American made. It's all, it's we don't outsource overseas. Our prices are higher, but we can deliver quicker and cheaper, and that makes it all about the same. And the company, our customers like the fact that they could call us up. It's not stuck on a ship somewhere in the Pacific or in customs in LA. Yeah, we'll put it on a truck and deliver it tomorrow. There's probably some considerations there.
And I think that's a really good example of all of these sort of inflationary analyses that I kind of see out there is, if we have tariffs of this, it's going to increase prices to that. They're very static analyses, right? That presumes any CFO, any COO is going to sit there and take whatever's delivered to them and not respond. And there are ways to respond. Onshoring is, one of them. I think the other issue that CFOs are going to have to deal with is access to capital. So, you're going to need to be able to finance the payment of these tariffs sooner than they would have otherwise need. First of all, the payments are going to be higher, and you're going to need to pay them sooner. What I learned recently is that the shipping companies are actually awash in cash as a carryover from the pandemic. So they'll actually potentially be a very good source of capital for, any kind of tariff related cash flow issues. That seems like a pretty reasonable service to offer to your clients that, want to use your shipping services.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I saw where I saw a journal article, Wall Street Journal, Walmart and a couple other people were already over in China telling their suppliers, suck it up, Buttercup. Tariffs are 20%, you're paying half. Skinny margins in China. The producers in China are like, we're already thin, and like, well, if you thought you were thin yesterday, think about tomorrow. Otherwise, we got to look at alternate sources, and it's really interesting. It's really interesting. This is kind of what I talk to people. You can't look at it, like you said, you can't look at it statically. It will be something, because CFOs and business leaders are smart, and they'll figure out how to adapt to, oh, we got a tariff over here. Okay, well, we'll figure out how to adapt to it in a different way. We'll look to 9 ways to Sunday to get what we want without it. And that's the one thing that people, the screaming and the people forget is, business leaders are actually pretty smart people, and they're always thinking about these things in advance. I mean, short-term financing versus long-term financing. Do you borrow short-term money for capital expenditures, or do you stretch it out a little bit? Those are all going to be fluctuating. Statistics, I guess, is the word that I want to throw in there. It's like, hey, look, it's a very dynamic environment right now. I listen to all the noise, and I'm like, it's really fun to watch. It's Game of Thrones, is what it is.
It really is, and obviously there's a ton of uncertainty in the market. Businesses hate uncertainty. Stock markets hate uncertainty. And so, that's a drag. But, this uncertainty is going to be resolved somehow as firms figure out how to, respond to what the tariffs end up being, what the industrial policy ends up being, and the like. So that certain uncertainty is going to resolve itself. It's, just we don't know what the end game is going to look like just yet.
Are you still bullish, or are you still kind of sitting on the side going, I want to see how this plays out?
So I'm bullish on the American economy and American business. No question. I have zero doubts on that. That has played out repeatedly over decades. It has never failed. When it comes to the market, the stock market, which tries to anticipate these things, we went into this pretty richly valued, and we've pulled back, but it's barely a correction at this point. So it doesn't fundamentally change what I'm going to do. I could see shifting, if it pulls back another 10%, that's a buying opportunity for me, overall. I particularly like Tesla. I mean, as I was not a fan of the stock. Forget about the company, forget about the cars, forget about the production. That's irrelevant. I've thought for a long time the stock itself was overvalued. But now with the 40% pullback and the cars are on fire. I like buying into that.
I'm kind of the same way. When Nvidia was at an all-time high, I'm like, no, I'm not buying that thing. It's a lot of that. I've been saying the same thing. It's like stock market's correct. They get overvalued. I think it was like 25, 26 times on the S&P. And it's concentrated in 7 to 10 stocks. I mean, all the gains have been 7 to 10 stocks. And so you're like, I think I'll sit this one out a while. I'll go buy the S&P 493, the S&P 490. I'll go buy all the other stocks and leave those ones alone. But I'm still very bullish as well. I mean, I think to me it's all fascinating, and there's so much noise in the air. I was so happy you came on because we talk about this every Saturday and Sunday too.
Yeah, no, it's this privilege. I brought my coffees just to make it like.
There you go. So I appreciate you coming on, Steve, and talking about it a little bit, and we're gonna have you on again.
Craig, that's awesome. I'm so tickled you invited me. It's been a ton of fun. So good luck with it.
See you tomorrow.